I'd like to welcome everyone on behalf of the Center for Latin American Studies and the University of California at Berkeley. We're very pleased to be here today and very much looking forward to this discussion on human rights, terrorism, and the issues surrounding the Abu Ghraib exhibit that the Center for Latin American Studies is presenting through March 23rd. These are deeply troubled times. We're in the midst of a disastrous war where all sides admit things are not going as planned. One of the key issues clearly is what takes place in the war, but another key issue is what this has done to the United States in terms of its values, in terms of issues of human rights, in terms of a whole set of broad policies. We have an unusual panel today, this afternoon, to discuss these issues. Unfortunately, we've asked everyone to give brief initial presentations, and then we hope to have a discussion afterwards. I'm going to introduce all our panel members at once, and then they will speak, and then we will move into the discussion, the questions and answers. We're going to start with Aryeh Neier, who is the president of the Open Society Institute and was formerly one of the founders and director of Human Rights Watch. Then we will hear from José Zalaquett, who is a professor of law at the University of Chile and is the former president of the Inter-American Human Rights Commission. Then we will hear from Jenny Martinez, who is a professor of law at Stanford and who argued the José Padilla case before the United States Supreme Court. And finally, we will hear from Phil Zimbardo, who is a professor of psychology at Stanford and who later this month will be coming out with a book on Abu Ghraib, The Lucifer Effect, Understanding How Good People Turn Evil. Please join me in welcoming our panel. And we're going to begin with Aryeh Neier.
Like others who have conducted human rights fieldwork, I've spent a certain amount of time interviewing witnesses or victims of torture. I must say that that experience never gave me a real visual impression of what torture is like. And I think the reason is that almost all of those who I interviewed, at least, were very reticent in describing their experience to me. It was clear in most cases that they felt humiliated by the experience. And when I saw the photos of Abu Ghraib, it helped to make clear to me why they felt that way, because the photos do show the victims in the most humiliating postures imaginable. They are seen as submissive or as terrified in the process of being tortured. And I was reminded of a book that was published more than 20 years ago by Elaine Scarry on the body in pain. And Scarry had written in that book that the ability to inflict torture is the ability to exercise absolute power over others. And it made me think of what seems to me the connection between what took place at Abu Ghraib and what has taken place generally since September 11, 2001. Because I think that if there is a connection between a variety of events, it is that interest in exercising absolute power. There have been many theories as to why the United States went to war in Iraq, and there have been varying rationales that have been provided by the Bush administration at different times for the invasion of Iraq. And I'm sure that all of them have some element of truth. But my own view had been at the time, and it remains my view today, that September 11 was an extraordinary demonstration of American vulnerability. Here were these enormous buildings that were destroyed by 19 people armed with box cutters. The Pentagon was seriously damaged. It's possible that if United Airlines 93 had not been forced down in Pennsylvania, the White House or the Congress would also have been hit. And it seems to me that the need to engage in a demonstration of American power was the most significant reaction that took place to September 11. And Saddam Hussein, who had been thumbing his nose at the United States, seemed to be a very good candidate for that demonstration of American power. I think there have been other efforts to demonstrate power. I think that some of the famous or infamous memoranda that circulated within the Justice Department and the White House, which are thought to have contributed to what took place at Abu Ghraib, also seem to reflect a preoccupation with power. The member of the faculty at this law school who has become somewhat notorious for his memos was not so much justifying torture per se. Rather, he was arguing that any attempt to limit what is done is an improper intrusion on presidential power, that the president has plenary powers, and that if they are not specifically abrogated by the Constitution, the president can do what the king could do. And the king had absolute authority over those who were taken prisoner, so the king was able to torture, and the president is able to torture. And if there are laws that are adopted by Congress that seek to restrict torture, then those laws can be overridden by the president. If there are international treaties such as the Geneva Conventions which seek to restrict torture, they can be suspended by the president because he has the power to engage in this. And then at this very low level of the guards at Abu Ghraib, there seems to have also been this effort to demonstrate absolute power over the prisoners who were there. The Botero images seem to me to capture this in terms of the helplessness and powerlessness of the victims of the torture. In a way, however, they don't tell us very much about the torturers. Their faces are rather blank in the paintings, and the young women who were participants are omitted from the paintings. But if you want to see an example of that exercise of absolute power, think of the photograph of Lindy England with a prisoner with a leash around his neck. And here is this tiny woman exercising absolute power over this prisoner, or of the other woman soldier who is smiling over the bodies of those who are stacked up in a pyramid. I think that if we are to deal with the torture and with many of the other things that have taken place since September 11, we have to, above all, question this idea, reject this idea of absolute power. We have to reject the idea that the president has this unilateral power to take the country into war, to disregard a resolution of the Congress that may oppose the increase in U.S. troops in Iraq, and above all, reject the idea that the president has powers that allow him to ignore the commitments of the United States in treaties like the Convention Against Torture and the Geneva Conventions and the statutes that seek to prohibit torture. Since we have only a short period, let me just end by pointing out that in one of the significant literary works that deals with the subject of torture, Kafka's story in the penal colony, Kafka describes the man who is about to be tortured. He's going to be tortured because he has questioned the authority of a superior officer, and thereby he has insulted that officer. And Kafka tells us that the person who was about to be tortured already seemed to be as submissive as a dog who might be left to run free on the hills that were surrounding the place where the torture machine was situated, and who simply could have been whistled to and brought to lie there and receive the torture. Of course, lie there face down naked while the torture machine worked on him, and he would only understand fully the torture he was undergoing after it had been underway for a certain amount of time. That's what torture is. It is this effort to secure absolute submission. We have tried to secure that kind of submission in Iraq. It has not worked. people don't like to be treated as submissive dogs. They tend to rebel under those circumstances when they have the opportunity to rebel. And so this effort to exercise absolute power is ultimately frustrated. But that seems to me the struggle that is taking place. Thank you.
We will describe the paintings if we can't get this to work.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I wish to begin by warmly thanking the Center of Latin American Studies in the person of its director, Professor Shaken, and his wonderful staff, as well as the sponsor of this strong art exhibition of Botero's work on the Abu Ghraib prison, for their invitation to participate in this panel discussion with such distinguished co-panelists. In my talk, I intend to present an overview of Western art's treatment of the themes of war, torture, and other man-made horrors. My starting point is the well-known proposition that art both echoes and contributes to shape the spirit of the times. I have divided the evolution I wish to sketch in three historical periods, followed by a kind of open-ended epilogue about the post-September 11 years in which we live at present. Of course, it is in this last period that Botero produced the artworks presently exhibited at Berkeley. The first period covers from the Renaissance to the time immediately before the surge and first enactment of the idea of the dignity and equality of all individuals, of the legitimacy of government being based on the free will of the people, and of fundamental rights and freedoms of the individual vis-à-vis the state. I'm talking at the period from the Renaissance until the end of the 18th century, and during this period, Western art largely avoided a moral stance other than a religious stance on war and torture. Of course, it is generally accepted that in the 18th century, the modern idea of human rights takes root, and it has developed over 3 centuries, first at domestic level, then at international level, and it has been the result of a blend of enlightened philosophical views, social action, and political action. And the starting point of this first enactments is dated at the time of the liberal or bourgeois revolutions in France and in America. During this period, the justification of political power were based on theological or dynastic arguments or on the fact that the ruler was able to conquer power and effectively hold on to it. Not all human individuals were considered persons before the law. Social and legal inequalities were explicitly sanctioned by political systems based on class and caste divisions. Torture and extreme suffering were basic tenets of the theological vision of Western civilization's dominant religion. In fact, they were at the very roots of its account of redemption and salvation by the submission of the Son of God to the cruelest forms of death by torture known at its time. And until not long ago, the accounts of the Christian theology of hell and condemnation were precisely consisting of the worst imaginable pain or torture pain being inflicted for eternity. Torture was also addressed by art's depiction of ancient myths. With some exceptions, the art works dealt with these subjects, sublimating them or treating them as a matter of fact or as an occasion for displays of formal or stylistic dexterities in the execution of artworks. Exception of this is the representation of the horrors of hell as torture, that would generally go to great lengths to awe and frighten the faithful. On the other hand, when art turned from religion and myths to reality, the religiously commanded practice of torture by the Inquisition was represented as a matter of fact, as documenting facts rather than pronouncing on them. Black people and indigenous populations were considered subhuman, and their enslavement or decimation and forceful subjugation or forceful conversion a rightful pursuit. Artworks reflected this, and they were always exception to this rule, but they were very rare. Let's see some examples. Here, there's the work by the late Titian, The Flaying of Satyr Martius. This satyr, this mythological character, challenged music god Pan, lost the challenge, and he was flayed. But as you may see, this is almost a pastoral scene. This person is playing a violin. Even the victim is not contorting or just, it's a peaceful scene. This late Titian is an example of an advanced style by this master of the 16th century. The same may be said of these Rubens of an eagle devouring the liver of Prometheus. The dramatism of the scene is not meant to impress with some kind of condemnation, but rather a display of formalistic views, the idea of terribilità, by contortions of the body and by extreme formal means, impressing people. That goes back to the Laocoon, this sculpture of the priests of ancient Greece struggling with the snakes that are turning around them, and then by Michelangelo's work, painting and sculpture, and finally by Rodin, this idea of the terribilità, shocking and awing the viewer by means of formal extreming the drawing and the contortions. Then you have crucifixion, the ultimate form of torture known at its own time, treated in a sublimated fashion. As the philosopher Ortega y Gasset said, here Christ seems to be almost comfortable in the cross. I mean, there are exceptions to this treatment, like this painting by Grunewald of extreme laceration and suffering, kind of anticipation of Mel Gibson's Passion of Christ, but they are rare. Really, normally they are sublimated, presented as a suffering that leads to redemption and salvation. As you may see in this example of Bernardino Luini's decapitation of John the Baptist. And when torture was presented with with much more horrific traits, it was in the depiction of hell, of punishment, rather than torture as being a sacrifice, a means of salvation. Turning to war, the view of war at that time was a glorification of war, a lordly pursuit, as in this painting by Paolo Uccello, or, if you wish, some kind of even festival. It's hard to see if this is a war or some kind of celebration that is going on, as in this painting by Altdorfer. And when it came from myth and religion to reality, the reality of torture under the Inquisition was more a documentation of a fact than any moral stance on it. And this is the water torture, and it's being just told about, rather than having a pronouncement on it. The same may be said about the rack, the famous or infamous form of torture. The same may be said also of slavery. It's a kind of a documentation of slave traffic and of the treatment of the indigenous populations, the genocide or decimation or subjugation of indigenous populations throughout the Americas. Now, all this brings us to the second stage. Following the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, there was an invasion of these Napoleonic forces of Spain. Ferdinand VII ran away, and the Spanish people put up a guerrilla warfare. That's where the name guerrilla comes from, the Spaniards. They resorted to any kind of home weapons or even agricultural instruments to fight the French troops, and they were subject to atrocious torture that they were depicted by Goya. Goya, just as Beethoven or Goethe, are examples of great geniuses or creators whose lives and works tried both the 18th century and the 19th century. And the late work in all of them is part of the modern world, whereas the early work is rooted still in the 18th century. In this case, we have this print from the series The Disasters of War. You may see, the dismembering of prisoners and the extreme atrocity, and it's implicit, of course, a condemnation of the hellish nature of war. The same may be said of this print, this painting, famous painting, the 3rd of May, the shootings, where, of course, the history of art is all in the background of the minds of all artists. And here you may see this image as it was recalled by one staff member of the center, of a man kind of not pleading for his life, but rather in a challenging way, in a protest, and a dignified protest before being shot, being kind of Christ-like and crucifixion-like. On the other hand, the executioners are a machinery that is much uniform and anonymous. And even when these painters turn again to the tradition of mythology, now they did that with a new eye, as with this famous Saturn devouring his children by the same Goya. Now you have a different view of cruelty. It's not a matter of fact, it's not a detached view. It is informed also by the values of the new era that they are trying to uphold. As you may know, Goya was declared liberal. Throughout the 19th century, we have other examples. This is Géricault, the French romantic painter, and also very realistic and depiction of executed people. Later on, the example of Manet's execution of the Emperor Maximilian. You may see also here the executors, with this single exception of a more standing apart soldier, as constituting a uniform, anonymous machinery. It will not be until the beginning of the 20th century and the First World War when we find another example as powerful as Goya, Disasters of the War. And there, the disasters of the war, not called that way, but depicted by the German expressionist Otto Dix. This is, of course, extraordinarily sardonic and bitter, but very, very powerful too in its own style. Here you have a soldier turned in the typical image of the skull or representing death, and here the gas masks seem also skulls or monsters, or they're defending themselves from the mustard gas. And in this other example, you find the depiction of war as madness. This is called Nocturnal Encounter with a Madman, a part of the war series. And also war as blindness. This is a depiction by singer Sargent of soldiers blinded by mustard gas and holding each other's shoulder to stay together and to move on. It's inevitable to think of this other picture from 4 centuries before by Bruegel of the blind leading the blind, which certainly Sargent had in mind when construing this pink painting. So now, after a century following the French and American revolutions, we have a period where the ideals of the Enlightenment were being still fought over, were still being sustained under great duress. And these ideas were of equality, not only of freedom, equality of all people in their dignity and fundamental rights, equality in the very condition of person before the law, and therefore a no to slavery, equality in their condition of equal citizens in an organized republican or democratic nation, and therefore no to class or caste, equality beyond arbitrary discrimination, and therefore no to discrimination on the basis of gender, race, religious beliefs, ethnic origin, or the like. These ideas were being still fought over, progress was being made, but it was far from, they were far from sufficient. In the same second period that, as we may see, we call it, and forgive me for having stepped over this, a period where art bears witness, denounces atrocity, and vindicates victims, rather than just going about a detached moral attitude concerning these crimes and atrocities. And the main characteristic are realistic, dramatic war atrocities. Sorry, there's an alteration of the line here. Realistic, dramatic depiction of war atrocities, a representation of political repression and torture, not only of war atrocities, but political repression and torture by dictatorship, and also as a countercurrent propaganda art. This is what we are examining in this phase that stretches from, say, the French Revolution to the Second World War and its immediate aftermath. Now, in the time of the Depression, this increased awareness of injustice is manifested in this depiction of Ben Shawn, the American artist, of the execution of Sacco and Vanzetti, the two anarchist union leaders, or in this terribly sardonic print by Reginald Marsh, another American painter. Is called, it is her first lynching. I mean, like the mother proudly raising the baby so that she can participate in her first lynching. In the Spanish War, of course, we have this paramount example of Guernica, the pivotal work of the century, perhaps, of the last century, artwork by Picasso. But once the Second World War started, the dominant trade was propaganda art, rather than the kind of more independent art views that we're seeing before. The noblest, perhaps, and most bona fide propaganda art is an American war artist by the name of Mitchell Jamison that accompanied the troops in World War II to depict the nobility of that anti-fascist war. You may see that in these examples. But fascist propaganda or communist propaganda was, of course, less nuanced and less sincere. And even Picasso fell into the propaganda trap with this terrible painting, in my view, of the massacre in Korea that doesn't hold a candle to Guernica. It was done under instructions from the Communist Party, which he had joined. It was not until Vietnam that, again, a more sincere approach to these problems developed. And apart from these two photographs that are, of course, very memorable in everybody's visual database, they are, you may find, again, the old Mitchell Jamieson, who now, 30 years later, went at his own expense to Vietnam to document that war. And look at what he saw, the same author of these kind of noble Second World War paintings. Here we have, this is called A Carousel of Death, Love, and War. And you may see, of course, the degradation of American soldiers in a whorehouse in Saigon, and all this in an atmosphere of death well, I lost the adjective in Spanish. It would be libertinaje. Naomi? Anyway, this is another example that brings back the dismemberment of Goya. Here there's a decapitated Vietnamese, and you may see the shadows of Americans. This is the same painter that 30 years before documented World War II. During the 60s and onwards, apropos of the Vietnam War and the civil rights movement in the United States, the whole international movement was spurred on human rights. And non-governmental organizations developed, and you may find here the example of Gulag art, followed by more realistic paintings of the political repression. This is a Leon Golub, a rare painting in which you find a depiction of the perpetrators that usually are seen as anonymous. And by poster art, this is an Amnesty International portrait art, one of the most powerful images by an artist named Torpor, to illustrate torture. Now, the whole conception of the perpetrator is, as you may see, anonymity, machinery, uniformity, same here and same here. We come to the third stage, and I will run real fast because we're short of time. Many countries overcome their past of war or dictatorship, and now the problem consists of building up a resolution to construct a fair society on the ashes of cruelty, human rights violation, war atrocities. Of course, the first example is the Holocaust that was being, although occurred in the World War II, was being documented more and more throughout the 50s and 60s. And it was soon recognized that trying to depict it by expressionistic means doesn't do justice to the enormity of the crime. I think this kind of representation is a failure. Whereas just the documentation of sites or side effects, or even resorting to cartoons as the work of Spielberg, Mouse. No one would have said that you could depict the Holocaust in cartoon, but it's an extremely successful artwork. Or to more abstract, quasi-spiritual monuments like this Berlin Plaza monument to the Holocaust, that try to convey a sense of the immensity, not by graphic depiction, by almost a spiritual means, if you wish. The same may be said of perhaps the paramount artist of the second half of the 20th century, Anselm Kiefer, the German, whose work, as you may see, is about sites where things did happen and they're not happening any longer. Like these fields that have been, the tanks passed through here and they raised all this mud, but they're not there anymore. Or the train have left to Auschwitz and there they are, the fields. or this is the building from the, give me just one moment, I'm about to finish. The building from the Third Reich after the defeat. This finally a mythological work is called Your Golden Hair Margareta. It's a mythological character from the German literature, and Your Ashen Hair Shulamite. That is a Jewish character. And this is a poem by Celan, represented by also symbolic means. Another example of symbolic representation, almost spiritual, is the Vietnam Wall. When it was first erected, more traditional people protested that they lacked more realism, and they insisted on this depiction of three realistically portrayed soldiers, a white man, a black man, and a Latino man. But people did embrace really the more spiritual monument rather than going about the more realistic one. The same about this monument from Taiwan, or this Peace Park built in Chile in the terrain that belonged to the most notorious site of torture of the secret police, Villa Grimaldi. Now there is a Peace Park built there. Now, in front of these atrocities, and I'm now finishing in 30 seconds, it's true. Chilean artist, internationally known Chilean artist Alfredo Yar, has depicted the massacre of Rwanda by means of putting together thousands and thousands of slides, all of the same image. And if you go about looking at the image through this lens, you find this interpellation, the eyes of a black child. The epilogue, September 11th, we have, of course, the disaster of the terrorist attack and the massive killing of thousands of Americans and other people in the world towers. And this evokes the notion of hell. It's a massiveness, although they are practically vaporized, these victims. But this is also evoked, of course, I'm not suggesting that there is a parallel between Abu Ghraib and September 11th on the Twin Towers. But the massiveness, the piling of bodies in a hellish image represented here in this Botero painting. And there we have these other Botero paintings. Mind you, now in America, you are going through problems that require that they be depicted in the old fashion of the previous phase, not in the abstract way, because it's not expected that in this country you have these kind of problems. So somehow, there's a decalage there. You have to go backwards for the kind of representation of these abuses. And so, and these are the last 15 seconds, so the last two images. If, as Alfredo Yar suggests, still we have the problem of the world being an endless prison in many respects, what is to be hope? And he places the hope in the innocence of children, like this image of a girl taken from the refugee camps of Vietnam, and also in the power of art and witnessing to uphold hope and to continue to uphold also the values of human rights. Thank you very much.
So the topic of my remarks today will be the law of torture. And in talking on this subject, I'm going to move from the area of visual representations of torture to the idea of legal representations of torture. Last night I heard a disturbing story about one person who had visited the Botero exhibit. And after looking at the images, the person was silent for some time. And then when pressed for their response, said that he thought the real problem with Abu Ghraib was not that it had happened, but rather that there had been photographs taken of it. And I obviously disagree with that, but the notion was that the problem was that there was a visual representation. I disagree with that individual's perception of the problem with Abu Ghraib, but I would like to make something of a parallel argument, and the argument I'd like to make today has to do with the legal representation of torture that we've seen since September 11th. what I will be arguing is that it's not simply the act of torture or the fact that the United States has engaged in torture since September 11th that makes this a particularly dire situation, but rather that the U.S. has attempted to legalize or to justify, to represent in our law the idea of torture. And this, I will suggest, goes against hundreds of years of progress in Anglo-American jurisprudence and in international law. So if I'd been giving a talk to you about the law of torture in the year 2000, I would have been talking about the law prohibiting torture, the law that had evolved since the 1400s, both in domestic legal systems around the world and in international law, to create an absolute prohibition on torture and also on cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. Torture is one of the strongest norms in international law today. It's one for which there is no derogation permitted. Both under international human rights law and under the laws of war, there is no emergency, no state of warfare that it can legally justify the practice of torture. Nevertheless, we know from human rights groups' estimates that torture has, in fact, recently been practiced in something like 2/3 of the countries around the world. An absolute legal prohibition, the practice of torture. So why is it more troubling that the U.S. has, since September 11th, attempted to legally justify torture when, in fact, it's such a common practice? And I will argue that the attempt to legally justify torture, rather than having it simply happen somewhere out of sight in a way that once discovered is disavowed and condemned, is that it is more dangerous and more degrading to a nation and a legal system to attempt to justify and to represent in the law the practice of torture than for the unfortunate and thing to simply happen. Why is it that this is a worse thing for it to do? And I will say there are two reasons for that. The first is what I call the loaded gun argument. Justice Jackson, who was the American who was on the U.S. Supreme Court and the chief prosecutor at Nuremberg, wrote a very famous dissent in the case of Korematsu. Korematsu, of course, was the case in which the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the Japanese internment camps in the United States during World War II and found that it was constitutional on the basis of race to intern Japanese Americans without any sort of probable cause that they were engaged in harmful conduct. Justice Jackson dissented in that case, and he said the problem with the Korematsu decision was not simply that the internment camps had happened, although that was a terrible thing, but if it had just happened, if it had just been a military order, it would have been something that would have passed away, that would no longer be there as a precedent. But the fact that the Supreme Court had upheld the Japanese internment camps, had said they not merely had happened, but they were lawful, they were constitutional. They were not something for the nation to be ashamed of or to repudiate, but rather something that had the imprimatur of law, made the Korematsu decision such a tragedy. And Justice Jackson said that decision would lay about like a loaded gun, there for governments to reach for in the future. And so the attempt to legally justify torture since September 11th, like the Korematsu decision, is a loaded gun that remains not only at the disposal of the United States in some future crisis, but also stands as a precedent for countries around the world, countries that point to the United States as an example of why torture might be necessary, who can call upon our experience to say, see, even the most powerful country in the world needs these extreme methods in fighting terrorism or other dangers. And even if we believe, against all evidence, that our own government always acts in good faith and always finds the right people, certainly we cannot say the same about all governments around the world that might invoke this precedent. But even beyond that, beyond this idea of the loaded gun, the other troubling thing about the attempt to legalize, to represent not only visually but in the law, the practice of torture, is that it degrades the government and the society that practices it when it adopts and is not ashamed of this conduct. What country can be proud to say we engage in cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment of the people under our control? And in explaining why this is such a dramatic departure from our traditions, I want to talk just a little bit about what the law of torture was prior to 2000. So for more than 600 years in Anglo-American legal tradition, and I refer to Anglo-American tradition because the U.S. legal system was descended from that of Britain, torture had been prohibited. So going back as far as the 1400s, the common law of England prohibited torture. And that was something that made English law stand apart from the law of continental Europe, which at that time not only allowed but actually encouraged the use of torture. The rules of evidence in Europe at that time required the confession of the accused, and this was an incentive for torture. The English common law, on the other hand, as early as the 1400s, prohibited torture. And at first it was not any sort of sign of moral statement on the practice, but was in fact more of a product of the rules of evidence in the jury system in England, which did not require confession in open court and allowed reliance on more circumstantial evidence. But within a few centuries, the English had become justly proud of the prohibition on torture that was a part of their law. It was occasionally practiced, however, in England outside the common law. In the 16th and 17th centuries, it was admitted that torture was illegal, but it nevertheless sometimes occurred outside the law as an exercise of the king's special prerogative or emergency powers, that is, the king's powers to override the common law. And the situations in which the king would invoke this power to authorize torture in violation of the common law are quite evocative of the circumstances that we've seen used in the past 6 years to justify torture today. Individuals who presented threats to the security of the state, people who planned to engage in acts of sabotage or treason, who would blow up the Houses of Parliament or otherwise plot against the stability of the government, people who today we might call terrorists. And so warrants for torture were used and were indeed one of the causes of the English Civil War, which represented a fundamental reallocation of the power between the king and Parliament. And one of the first acts of the Long Parliament in 1640 at the conclusion of that war was to abolish the Court of Star Chamber, the court in which torture warrants had been used. And the last torture warrant was issued in England in 1640. In 1707, Scotland, when it became unified with England, also prohibited torture, and so by the time the United States was created in 1776, torture was prohibited not only in the common law, which we inherited, but also even against the king's invocation of his emergency or prerogative powers. Torture was an absolute prohibition. The U.S. inherited this legal heritage, and throughout the first 2 centuries of our jurisprudence, this became embedded in U.S. constitutional law and interpretations of the Eighth Amendment and the Due Process Clause. Indeed, the practice of torture is so condemned that you rarely even see that word in U.S. legal decisions. Instead, the cases talk of things like involuntary confession or coerced interrogation and prohibit the use in evidence of materials obtained through coercive interrogation, prohibit the use of involuntary confessions in court. And those things have been found by the courts to be inadmissible, not only because they're unreliable, but because it degrades the court and the legal system to receive them into evidence. At the same time, a parallel development was occurring in international law, beginning with the laws of war. And so here we have, again, something precisely parallel to the situation we face today, with the king in England invoking the prerogative power to torture in the face of what we might call terrorists. And in the 19th century, the prohibition against torture in international law evolving specifically in the context of warfare. So during the American Civil War, when President Lincoln invoked many extraordinary powers, which are sometimes used today in support of the argument that you need to break some eggs to make an omelet, nonetheless, during the Civil War, President Lincoln's government propagated the Lieber Code, which is the predecessor of the modern laws of war, and contained many provisions on military necessity that are no longer part of the law of war today. But one thing that was significant was that the provisions on military necessity in the Lieber Code did not allow cruel treatment of prisoners, nor extortion to court confessions of prisoners, even if that might be deemed expedient under the circumstances. Those things were exempt from the doctrine of military necessity under the Lieber Code. And that was in a war that was being fought against a rebel army that many would have called unlawful combatants. This prohibition in the laws of war became internationalized in the Hague Regulations of 1899 and 1907, carried forward to the Geneva Conventions of 1929 and 1949, which also included this absolute prohibition on torture, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. Following World War II, this prohibition in international law was expanded beyond the realm of the laws of war to encompass international human rights law, which applies in peacetime as well, from the practice of the Nuremberg trials through the UN Charter, which made protection of human dignity a fundamental goal of the international legal system. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was unanimously adopted by the General Assembly in 1948, prohibited torture and made, again, the protection of human dignity one of its core values. This was carried forward in other international instruments like the European Convention on Human Rights in 1950, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights in 1966, and the Convention Against Torture, which was open for signature and ratification in 1987, and which the U.S. has ratified along with the International Covenant. So we have together, over the past 600 years, a universal movement in the law towards the absolute prohibition of torture in all circumstances, even when the executive believes that it's necessary because of an emergency or because of terrorism, even in wartime, even against unlawful combatants. And so what's so remarkable about what has happened in the United States in the past 6 years is not simply that we have tortured, but the fact that we have attempted to claim that it's lawful. And here I refer specifically to the torture memos, in which no doubt many people here at Bolt Hall are familiar with, the definition in which it does two things that are especially troubling. First, a definition of torture that is so narrow as to give lawyers the worst kind of reputation for technical construction and looking for loopholes in something that any person with common sense could see is not what was the drafters of a law meant. But more troublingly, the argument, as Aryeh talked about, that not just that certain things might not constitute torture, but that even if they were torture, that the president had the absolute power to do it, the absolute power under the Commander-in-Chief Clause to override the will of Congress, to override international conventions that the Senate had ratified, and to determine that torture was nonetheless necessary. This is an argument that was rejected in 1640 in Great Britain. Okay. Following the Supreme Court's decision in the Hamdan case striking down the president's military commissions, we saw yet another attempt to make torture a part of our law in the Military Commissions Act, which was hailed by many as something of a restraint on the executive through the efforts of Senators John McCain and Graham and others. And while it certainly removed some of the worst things that were in the draft, by no means was it a good law. And specifically, it embeds in the law torture in ways that were not there before it was passed. And so, in one respect, it changes the rules of evidence applicable in military commissions and allows the admission of evidence that was obtained through coercion, something that is not allowed constitutionally in our system and has not been allowed for many years. And indeed, if the coercive interrogation took place prior to December 30th, 2005, would allow that to take place, even if the coercive interrogation methods used violated the cruel, unusual, or inhumane treatment or punishment prohibited by the 5th, 8th, and 14th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution. So perhaps not torture, but cruel, inhuman, cruel, unusual, and inhumane treatment, nothing for a legal system to be proud of. So, too, in its amendments to the War Crimes Act, by removing the prohibition or the criminal punishment that the War Crimes Act gave for all violations of Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions, including the prohibition in Common Article 3 on outrages on personal dignity, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, and replacing that with a much narrower provision and applying that retroactively so as to immunize individuals in the United States government who might have engaged in practices that were outrages on human dignity or cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. Again, embedding in our law not simply the fact that torture has happened, but legal endorsement, authorization, and sanction for it. Other countries that have in recent years confronted the threat of terrorism and the question of torture have gone in the other direction in terms of their legal rulings. And rather than speaking too much longer, I'll just mention two briefly. The first, the decision of the British House of Lords in December 2005 in the case of A and others. That case concerned whether evidence obtained through torture by other countries would be admissible in immigration proceedings in the United Kingdom. And the House of Lords rejected this practice. They referred not only to the inherent unreliability of evidence obtained through torture, to the cruelty of those who were wrongfully tortured, who were never convicted of any crime and who might have been taken by mistake, but also to the notion that torture degraded all those who participated in it, as well as the nation that sanctioned it. They cited the decisions of other high courts around the world, including the Court of Ireland, which spoke of the moral defilement of a legal system that endorsed torture, courts in Canada and Australia. The Israeli High Court, in its decision on coercive interrogation practices that constitute cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, also rejected the idea of giving legal sanction to those. And in so doing, the Israeli Supreme Court said the destiny of democracy is that not all means are open to it. And it said that although democracies must often fight with one hand tied behind their backs, they nevertheless have the upper hand. And what the Israeli Supreme Court meant by that was that by staying true to their values, they preserved those things which they were defending and made clear that in the process of protecting the security of a nation, one could not at the same time destroy those very things that made the nation worth defending. And so, in conclusion, what I would like to argue, as you think about the visual representations of torture in the Botero exhibit and the argument that some have made that the problem with Abu Ghraib was not simply that it happened, but that someone took a photograph. The problem with the United States torture policy since September 11th is not simply that it has happened, but the fact that we have embedded it in our law.
Got to dim that a little bit. Can we dim the light a little bit? There you go. Thank you. I'm here from Stanford to honor Harley Shaken, the Center for Latin American Studies, UC Berkeley, and of course Fernando Botero. Harley Shaken had the wisdom and fortitude to take a show that a small show of an artist in a New York gallery that had gotten mixed reviews and limited reviews, and to transport it here. No mean feat, and to do it in a very short time with the backing of the Center for Latin American Studies and UC Berkeley, resisting any possible conservative pressures and political pressures not to do this. And in a very short time, the university made major renovation to, I guess it was a student study area, to create a wonderful visual space for this art. I had the privilege at the preview of meeting Fernando and talking with him. And essentially what he said was he was so shocked by those images of American people, American soldiers doing these horrible things. And he was so outraged, and he didn't know how to direct his outrage, but being an artist, he directed it in the way he knew best. And he spent 2 years passionately making, I think it's something like 86 paintings, full-size. If you haven't seen them, six-foot-tall paintings and images, and wanted to give them away, and nobody wanted to take them. Wanted to give them away to a museum that would show all of them. And now, because of what Berkeley did, there are other museums. I think it's going to be shown in American University, and other museums want it, and it's getting reviewed around the world. And it's one way to funnel, channel outrage. And my concern has been almost no outrage in America over the Abu Ghraib thing, really. There's been even worse, no outrage against the Military Commissions Act. Everything I'm going to show you, and I'm going to show you pictures you've never seen from Abu Ghraib that complement Fernando's, almost all of that is acceptable now because the President and his legal aides have defined it that way in the Military Commissions Act, and your Congress has voted in, because humiliation is not torture. Most of what happened in Abu Ghraib was sexual humiliation and other forms of humiliation. No one was killed in Abu Ghraib. No one was beaten up in Abu Ghraib, only on occasion. But so here, those of you who haven't seen it, here's just some of his pictures. Of course, he uses a technique that's made him famous, actually a technique I do not like, of huge, obese people, animals. But here, what makes it powerful is it's the flesh. It's the destruction of the flesh by dogs, by whipping, by beating, and it makes it that more powerful. If it were scrawny little people, it was people who all look the same, dark Arabs, it wouldn't have the same impact, I think. This leads me to my talk, which is called The Lucifer Effect, Understanding How Good People Turn Evil. And I'm going to describe how I channeled my outrage at September 11th in very different ways, given I'm coming from a psychological background. And for me, I begin by looking at this wonderful illusion by the artist M.C. Escher. And if you look at it, some of you will see angels and some of you will see devils. If you focus on the white as the figure, you see a world full of angels, little nice tutus dancing around. But some of you, and we don't know exactly why, look at it and see the devils, see the beast here with the horns. And so if you see black as the figure and white as the background, it's a world full of devils. If you see white as the figure and black as the background, it's a world full of angels. And that tells me several things. One, the world has been, and always will be filled with good and evil, because that's part of the human condition. Secondly, it reminds me that God's favorite angel, Lucifer, disobeyed God because God, if you remember, wanted all the angels to honor Adam, his most perfect creature. And Lucifer says, no, I was here before him. I will not honor him. And so, and I'm better than him. So it was a sin of pride, the sin of jealousy, envy, and disobedience. And God sent Michael the archangel and whipped his butt, and Lucifer and the other angels were kicked out. And Lucifer became the devil. Okay? So the Lucifer effect, for me, is that ultimate transformation of God's favorite angel to the devil. I mean, that's the most extraordinary transformation you could imagine. And in all my research, I focused on lesser character transformation, starting out with people who are good, ordinary people. And I'm going to put them in situations where we're going to do bad things. Not devil things, but just bad evil for a short period of time, which I'll describe to you in a moment. The question of what makes people evil, what makes people go bad, has been asked by theologians, by philosophers, historians. Psychologists try to avoid those kind of questions because they're too big. We like to ask very simple, focused questions. We give a simple, focused answer. But I also have a background in sociology, anthropology, and I grew up in the ghetto in the South Bronx. I grew up around evil, amid evil. So I'm going to begin with a case study, and my case study is of the images of what happened in Abu Ghraib. Some of them you've seen, many of them you have never seen. When I saw those images, I don't know, April 21st, 2004, I was outraged. I was shocked like most of you, but I was not at all surprised because they were very familiar to me personally, because I had seen them in my prison, because I was a prison superintendent, and I observed abuses and tortures, and I allowed it to go on. These are horrible pictures. They start mild, and they actually depict the process that happened over a 3-month period. I put them in this dramatic sequence for you. Many of these are embargoed. The Pentagon and the Bush administration is not allowing most of these pictures to be shown. There's a circuit court ruling which may come down to release them. I was an expert witness for Chip Frederick, the sergeant in charge of Tier 1A. All the abuses occurred just in one tier in Abu Ghraib, in Tier 1A, which was the soft torture center, in the dungeon in Tier 1A. That's where they brought all of the detainees who they thought had some intelligence. At first, there were a few hundred. At the end of 3 months, there were 1,000. Okay, and so as part of the expert witness, I was for his legal counsel was Gary Myers, who did it pro bono. Interestingly, he was also counsel in the My Lai massacre when he was a young lawyer. So we're going to look at this and then compare these images with those that came out of an artistic imagination. This came out of the creative, evil imagination of what I'm going to argue is good American boys and girls. Sound.
Sound. Can we turn on the
sound?
Good. So pretty powerful and pretty ugly. And so the first question is, who are the monsters that could have done such thing? And there are more than 1,000 pictures and videos. And so this is a selection of some of those that I put in this sequence. Of course, how do we understand that behavior? Well, the military immediately, the Bush administration, all did the usual thing that every police department does when there's a scandal in the country, that every school does when there's a scandal. They say it was a few bad apples. What I love about this cartoon is the bad apple is part of the Rumsfeld tree. And so the apple not only doesn't fall far from the tree, the apple is part of that tree. The bad apple is what's known as the dispositional orientation. That is, you locate the problem in the person, and by isolating that person, then you've dealt with the problem. It's what the Inquisition was all about. The Inquisition was all about evil. How do we understand evil in a place that an all-good, all-perfect, all-powerful God has created? Well, there was a very torturous analysis in Malleus Maleficarum, a really a legal analysis that became the handbook of the Inquisition in all Catholic countries. And essentially, they said it was the devil continuing to do his evil deeds as he did against Adam, and God permits the devil to do it to test human character, but God has now forbidden the devil to work his evil directly on people. But the devil's kind of shrewd. He works through witches, people who sleep with him. And so the whole Inquisition was about identifying who is the middleman, but it was almost a middle woman, between the devil and us. And once you have your witch identification program in practice, you identify them, get them to confess, and that's where torture got legitimized, because it was state and church combined in this witch hunt that went on for decades in Catholic countries, created the worst evil, the worst legitimized evil I think the world has ever known. So a different way to frame the question. When you say who is evil, there's only one answer. It's people. So who is the person? We find them, we arrest them, we get them to confess, we use torture, whatever. We imprison them, we kill them, and evil ceases to exist. Hasn't ceased to exist in the Inquisition. It's not going to cease to exist in military prisons, having put these 9 military policemen in jail. When you say what is to blame, it could be people, but it could also be the situation. As a social psychologist, I'm going to argue that situations corrupt people, that good people can be led to do evil things, that in a very short time, I can make most of you do things you would now say are unimaginable, until you're in a situation that I have created for you, playing the role of one of these creators of these evil situations. There were 12 investigations after the Abu Ghraib incident. They were called independent investigations. Hardly so. 11 of the 12 were headed by generals. The 12th one was headed by James Schlesinger, a former Department of Defense secretary, and he was ordered by Rumsfeld. And all of these were focused on the grunts. They were explicitly not allowed to focus on the upper command. But it was so overwhelmingly true that it was the situation system that all of these reports slip in some reference. And I'm one of the few people who read all of them. There are several hundred pages. And in fact, recently, General Myers said, hey, there have been, what, 10, 12 of these things? And they all show it was just these few bad apples. Obviously, he didn't read anything. Because if he read the Schlesinger report, it says, psychologists have attempted to understand how and why individuals and groups who usually act humanely can sometimes act otherwise in certain circumstances. That's my Lucifer effect. The landmark Stanford study provides a cautionary tale for all military operations, but of course they never paid attention to it. He contrasts a relatively benign Stanford experiment, which I'm going to show you in a moment, with what happens in military places. He said in military detention operations, soldiers work under stressful combat conditions that are far from benign. And then he goes on to list a full set of stresses and psychological principles taken right out of my work and other psychologists. Can we make it louder?
Prisoner 819 did a bad thing. Prisoner 819 did a bad thing.
Police car pulls up in front, and a cop comes to the front door and knocks and says he's looking for me. So they, right there, they took me out the door. They put my hands against the car. It was a real cop car. It was a real policeman, and there were real neighbors in the street who didn't know that I was. This was an experiment, and there was cameras all around and neighbors all around. They put me in the car. Then they drove me around Palo Alto. They took me to the police station, the basement of the police station. Then they put me in a cell. I was the first one to be picked up, so they put me in a cell, which is just like a room with a door with bars on it. You could tell it wasn't a real jail. They locked me in there in this degrading little outfit. They were taking this experiment too seriously.
Well, indeed we were. The dramatic pickups by the police were designed to take away their freedom, even though they had volunteered to be in this experiment, which was going to run for 2 weeks. We did it at Stanford after the summer school was over at Cal and Stanford because kids needed money and they were around. There were only 2 Stanford students in it. It was called Stanford Prison Experiment because it was done at Stanford. These are students from all over the country and Canada. So we got 75 volunteers. We gave them a battery of personality tests, clinical interviews. We only picked 24 who were the most normal, most healthy college students from all over the country. And then we did what you do in a good experiment. You flip a coin and say, you're a guard, you're a prisoner, you're a guard, you're a prisoner. So we begin with two groups are interchangeable. No difference between kids who happen to be assigned to be guards and those happen to be assigned to be prisoners on August 14th, 1971. Of course, we have it's really like a Greek drama. We're going to put good people in a bad place to see does the place win or the people. And then we put them in costumes with symbols of power on the guards. We recreate an anonymous environment in the base of the psychology department. Prisoners, we call de-individuation, take away their identity, give them numbers. They have to wear like women's smocks. Instead of shaving their heads, they have nylon stocking caps. This is what our yard looks like in action. There was a hole. We made it as functionally realistic as we could. There were parole board hearings, there were public defenders, prison chaplains coming down. There was visiting hours. An ex-convict, I taught a summer course with him before, so I got to understand the psychology of imprisonment. And it initially began like summer camp or hazing. The guards were awkward in their role, the prisoners were awkward in their role. At the end of one day, I've said, this is over. Nothing's happening, it's boring. And the second day, the prisoners rebelled. And that was transformed the whole thing because suddenly the guards saw them as dangerous. And so it began as menial little acts, escalated over time. Extreme stress. The guards created a totally arbitrary, capricious environment where prisoners developed what's called learned helplessness. Each day after this 36 hours of the first day, prisoners broke down. The kid you saw, Doug Corpy, prisoner 8162, he was the first one to break down. He was a Berkeley student. He was a ringleader of anti-war activities at Berkeley. But the guards broke him in 3 days, in 36 hours, on their own. Again, obviously, as an experiment, I just said, you're on your own. And they invented these creatively evil actions. Why was I not surprised at the picture of Abu Ghraib? Nakedness was a standard tactic guys used to humiliate men. Bags over their heads. In addition, sexual degradation. After the third day, each day, guards were degraded prisoners more and more using sexually degrading acts. We have a wonderful website, prisonexperiment.org, that has slides and video clips and everything ever written about the study, plus lots about correction. So that's really artificial. It's not a real prison. What are the real-world parallels? Well, compare this. The prisoners are about to go to parole board hearing with bags over their heads and chained feet, with U.S. soldiers in Iraq with their captives and bagged heads. Here's Guantanamo. Soldier can't even look at it. It's so disgraceful. So here's the guy he defended. Here's the monster. This is days before he went down to that dungeon. He's the most patriotic, all-American person I have ever met. I arranged for him to have a battery of psychological tests. I interviewed him. I interviewed his wife, his sister. I got all of his prison. He was a prison guard in a low-security prison. People always say he had experience. A low-security prison in Virginia. He was in charge of nobody other than on his little yard. And now he's in charge of 1,000 prisoners, okay, in this hostile environment. So he is my Lucifer effect. He was exactly like one of the good guards in the Stanford prison study on day one. And at the end of 3 months, he did the horrible things that you saw, like this, like this. This is a mentally ill patient who used to cover himself with shit. And what they used to do, they call him shit man. They used to wrap him and roll him in dirt. But he was one of the two people, he and Sabrina Harmon, who thought up this little gag. They had prisoners had to stand on a box that was stress position until they fell off, their ankles gave way, with hoods over their heads, and they decided to add electrodes. It was just a game because they really were not real electrodes, except he didn't know that. And so here he is actually taking a picture of that. That's the worst thing he did. So I call it the banality of evil in modern times. So this is him. This is him. This is him shortly afterwards. So who was responsible for the use of dogs to induce fear, nakedness of prisoners, these extreme stress positions, sleep, food, sensory deprivation, culturally insensitive, humane tactics, concealing illegal practice from Red Cross, of abuses, suicides, and 21 murders of detainees throughout all of our prisons, excluding Abu Ghraib. Those are all handed down by Rumsfeld, General Miller, and Sanchez. Not one of those were things that these guys thought of. And all of those, most of those are abuses of humiliation, and they do not qualify as torture in the Military Commissions Act. So for me, the tragedy of Abu Ghraib is that good American soldiers were corrupted by the bad apple in which they too were imprisoned. That bad prison barrel was placed within even worse barrel of an immoral war. But as a social psychologist, I've always been focused on, is the situation more powerful than individuals? I've never asked the question, who creates the situation? I didn't ask it in the Stanford prison study because I created it and therefore I ended it. But once I got involved in Abu Ghraib, the question, that's the real question. It's not who did that, it's who created those conditions. Chip Frederick worked from 4 o'clock at night to 4 o'clock in the morning, 7 days a week for 40 days without a day off. In unsanitary conditions, fearful conditions, the place was bombarded, 5 soldiers, 20 prisoners were killed by mortar shells from buildings across the street. There were constant escapes, there were constant riots by prisoners, there was no sanitation, prisoners were all naked or in panties or in jumpsuits, and he is supposed to be in charge of this. There's also military police, CIA, civilian interrogators from Titan Corporation, Navy Blue SEAL coming and going because that was a torture center. And they told these guys, your job is to soften them up. And so that's what they got rewarded for. And if they didn't get actionable intelligence, the military intelligence put pressure on the military police. There is supposed to be a separation in the military. Military police are supposed to maintain the security of the prison, period, and not to work in that way with military intelligence. So I want to argue that these bad barrels were designed, crafted, maintained, mismanaged by the bad barrel makers from top down in the military and Bush administration. Jenny has given you some idea of that, the architects of this, many of the lawyers on the legal teams. My argument is they're fully complicit in torture and abuses and should be tried for their crimes against humanity. And I want to end with this. General Counsel of Navy, Alberto Mora, said when he learned about the intensive torture of one of the prisoners in Guantanamo, where they tortured him day in and day out for more than a month, the logs somehow leaked out, and it was a whole expose in Time magazine. I'm sorry. He says, if cruelty is no longer declared unlawful, but instead is applied as a matter of policy, it alters the fundamental relationship of man to government or woman to government. The Constitution recognizes that man has an inherent right, not bestowed by the state or laws, to personal dignity. That's the bottom line, not only in America but around the world, including the right to be free of cruelty. It applies to all human beings, not just in America, even those designated as, quote, unlawful enemy combatants. If you make this one exception, the whole Constitution crumbles. He said it's a transformative issue. I elaborate on this and much more in my book, which I hope you'll read. Thank you.
I'd like to thank all 4 of our panelists for some really engaging, important presentations that have put a lot of issues on the table. We'd like to ask for questions from the floor. We ask that you keep the question brief, one question, so we can have as much of a discussion from the panelists as possible. Yes.
This question is for Dr. Zimbardo, and I'm curious.
Could you hang on 1 second? We're going to bring a mic.
Oh, thank you. Dr. Zimbardo, would you be willing to talk about the role of organized psychology in interrogations, and particularly in the APA's current support for the McCain law?
Hello, this is not working. Is it working? I can't tell. Okay, great. It's a complicated issue. Many psychologists and psychiatrists work for the military as interrogators or advisors to interrogators. Many of them do it as a job. They make money from it. A lot of them know about human nature. There's been a program called the SEER program, Survival, Escape, Resistance, Survival, Evasion, Resistance, Escape. It was started after the Korean War because American soldiers gave germ warfare confession. Not just soldiers, these were officers in the Air Force. Instead of saying name, rank, and serial number, you know, they were broken in a very short time by Chinese communist mind control tactics. And so the SEER program started in, I think, maybe first in the Air Force, but now all programs have it. And essentially, it's a survival games that you play. There are a set of prisoners, and you escape, and they have to catch you, and they catch you, they try to break you, make you confess to things that you had been told earlier. And so this has been going on in all the forces. The main place is Fort Bragg, and there's a psychologist in charge of it at Fort Bragg. And the notion is we're going to learn things so our soldiers can resist those interrogations. But also, what do you learn on the other side? If you do reverse engineering, you learn what breaks them. And so the notion now is that the military has been using information they have gotten from psychologists from these SEER programs to more effectively build into interrogation. There was a big controversy within the APA. Lots of people are against this. The APA takes a position, it's exactly like the book. We don't torture. We believe in human rights, human dignity. And they had a panel, a task force, PENS, psychologists engaged in national security, PENS. It was slightly biased. Of the 10 people on the panel, 6 had DOD connections. One of them was the guy running the program at SEER. Another one was a Navy colonel in the infantry. And the first thing they said is there has to be unanimity. There'll be no dissenting opinion, 1. Secondly, that nobody could take notes, 2. Thirdly, they ended up agreeing not to the Geneva Conventions, but to the Bush limited thing, not to have endorsed an international standard, but just an American standard. They had to do it. They were in the military. So it was 6 against 4, essentially, and so the APA endorsed that. The APA has been backing off now, saying, no, we're against torture. Well, Condi Rice says we don't torture. Everybody says we don't. Nobody says we torture anymore. I mean, it's not like the good old days in Brazil and Argentina and Greece. They were proud. Yeah, we torture. I mean, that's what we train. We have the whole police. We train them to do that. So it's in this funny place. There's going to be a big convention in August in San Francisco, and groups of people like me have put this on the major agenda. There's going to be like 12 hours of programs about torture and about psychologists' involvement in this, and the American Psychological Association's complicity. They get a lot of money from the military. They get a lot of money from the Department of Defense. There's a whole division of psychology called military psychology. So here's now these kind of system pressures which are taking place, but there's also system pressures of people with different values opposing it.
Do any of the other presenters have any comments on this and any dimension of this? Okay. Yes.
Hi, this is a question for Ms. Martinez. You had talked about the legalization of torture as being, almost a bigger problem than the torture itself. And I sort of have one reaction to that, which is that it doesn't seem like it's actually being legalized, but it's almost a sort of the legal system is turning a blind eye to the practice of torture. And I was wondering how you responded to arguments that have been voiced by, people like Alan Dershowitz, where they say that it would be better if we're going to practice torture to formalize it and regulate it rather than just, denying and hiding it.
I think Professor Dershowitz is flat out wrong on that. And partly that's for the reasons that I've talked about, the fact that the legalization of torture degrades the legal system that does it. It's like the quotation that Phil put up from General Mora, that a system that endorses cruelty, a government that says that cruelty is something that it practices towards individuals, is a government that fundamentally changes the relationship between the individual and the state in a way that's inconsistent with our Constitution and that's inconsistent with fundamental principles of international human rights law. I also think that practical experience shows that such things don't work, that don't work in 2 senses. One, that information obtained through torture is quite unreliable. People will say anything in order to avoid being tortured, and so the justification in favor of degrading the legal system and the nation in that way is not there. And second, that any system for legalizing it inevitably leads to by condoning it leads to the practice of it even outside the parameters in which it's been endorsed. And I think that goes again back to what Phil talked about in terms of the experience at Abu Ghraib. Those things certainly weren't authorized. That the pointless humiliation and degradation of prisoners was not authorized by Rumsfeld or by the Bush administration. None of their policies were designed to promote purposeless humiliation of prisoners who had no intelligence value. And yet the overall approach in Bush administration policy to say that the gloves were off, that the legal prohibitions no longer applied, that the Geneva Conventions didn't apply to prisoners in the war on terror, that these types of tactics, the use of dogs, the use of humiliation, could be used in some circumstances, inevitably led to their abuse at Abu Ghraib.
Before we move on, I'd like to briefly ask José Zalaquett, would this debate on torture be any different in Chile in terms of how the positions are framed?
Well, actually, except for some people who uphold in a fundamentalistic view the law of Sharia, I'm not aware of anyone who claims that they are torturing and so what. Actually, torture is generally denied. Therefore, the absolute prohibition of torture is paid lip service. Of course, it's behind the scenes, it occurs. Mm-hmm. So there was never a debate about whether this or that act of torture was justified. It was simply denied by the government. And this brings an interesting point, the point of denial. And here I, of course, defer to the professor of psychology, Professor Zimbardo. People have studied, I gather, that the psychology of denial occurs not only at the individual level, but also at the societal level. When you have a conflict between a basic value and a basic loyalty, you have to resolve that conflict. Say a parent abusing a child, and you resolve the conflict by denying one of the factors, there was no abuse. Or a country supporting a dictatorship, like Hitler or Pinochet, but you deny, well, we never knew what happened. Mm-hmm. Because otherwise it's very difficult to live at peace with your own conscience. And that brings the issue of truth. Torture is one of those crimes that are always denied because the absolute prohibition has taken a hold in international norms. And you cannot argue, well, you understand that this problem is very serious, so we had to torture them. It's like arguing we had to enslave them, you know. It was only temporary. They are a slave for 6 months, but we had to enslave them because we had a problem there. It's unarguable. You cannot do that. Mm-hmm. And when you face that, you deny. And when you deny, your supporters, they want to believe that, they pretend that they believe in that, or they need to believe that. And in order to reconstruct a certain basic sense of moral civility after a period of conflict, you need to rend apart that veil of denial and to put it on the table that those things did happen so that no one can deny that. And that has led to this idea of truth commissions and acknowledgement and all that. Precisely on the crime of torture, disappearances, and secret killings, they are the focus mainly of these exercises because the main purpose is to make what was denied undeniable.
Okay. Yes.
I would like to ask Aryeh Neier if he could give us a sense of the reaction to Abu Ghraib outside the United States.
There has been country after country where what took place at Abu Ghraib has been cited by governments in justifying their own policies. But aside from that, one of the consequences of what took place is that the United States used to be a voice internationally on behalf of human rights and had some impact in promoting human rights internationally, even when the United States had a mixed record and supported governments that engaged in abuses of human rights. Americans still had a certain amount of credibility as opponents of human rights abuses because many challenged U.S. government practices, and those challenges often put the spotlight on human rights abuses in various countries. But the thing I often cite to indicate the inability of the United States to command support on its positions on human rights is what happened at the United Nations when there was the vote recently to establish a new Human Rights Council to replace what had been the discredited UN Human Rights Commission. In fact, the United States position was probably the right position at the UN. Nevertheless, because it was the United States that was taking the position, there were only 3 other countries that were willing to join with the United States. The 3 other countries were Israel, the Marshall Islands, and Palau. Other than that, no country in the world was willing to join with the United States, and it reflected the sort of low status that the United States has internationally in speaking out on human rights. So it has both had this effect of helping to legitimize terrible practices in many other countries, but it's also completely eliminated the capacity of the United States to be an effective voice on human rights internationally.
We have time for 2 more brief questions. Yes.
Thank you. Following on from that last question, I'm actually from the United Kingdom, and it's very interesting to have an outside perspective on the portrayal of Abu Ghraib. I'd like to ask the panel, in particular Jenny Martinez, on your perspective of the UK's role post 9/11 in being a partner with the United States in this push to legalize torture, particularly in the context of the recent execution of Saddam Hussein, in the context of capital punishment in the United States. After all, the United States being one of the only members of the Western world that still tortures and executes its own citizens.
I think it's a very interesting question, and certainly Prime Minister Blair's government has cooperated with the Bush administration in a number of the more controversial policies. I would say that the courts in Britain under the Human Rights Act have been more forward even than the U.S. Supreme Court in terms of rejecting some of the human rights abuses that could have been endorsed, things like the use of evidence obtained through torture or indefinite detention of aliens and things like that. What I was struck by when I was in London about a month after the July subway bombings and was watching television, and in the debate over what additional powers should be given to the government there, I was struck by, while they had an advocate from a human rights group criticizing the Blair government's proposal and they had someone defending it, the specter of debate was quite different from that in the U.S. in terms of it was a question of would individuals be detained for 60 days or 30 days, not the detention of several years without access to counsel or access to the courts. So I would say that the reaction, they've faced a similar debate, from my own limited outsider's view, a similar debate, but they've been quite a bit more constrained in terms of the rule of law. And part of that may be the integration with the rest of Europe and the effect of the European Convention.
Yes.
Hi, thank you. I'm actually a member of Psychologists for Social Responsibility, which is related to some of what Philip is working on in the APA. But in addition to that, I'm a mental health client activist, and I have been most of my life. And what in our movement internally is concerned with human dignity and the fact that much of what, many times what is called treatment is abusive of human dignity. And torture, international torture, is for the purpose of getting information, which is of social good, allegedly, and treating people.
We need actually, unfortunately, a quick question because we're trying to
give
conclude.
Questions there, sir. I just wanted to know what kind of interpretation of the clinical issue that Dr. Zimbardo would have.
I don't understand the question.
Well, okay. I mean, in other words, is treating people in the name of treatment in America a social value which is degrading our own way of engaging this terrible matter of attacking people's dignity through torture?
I'm still not understanding. I mean, I'm not sure you're extending it to treatment of people in mental hospitals?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Or behavioral management, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, that's too hard to answer in a minute. I mean, one of the big problems with Abu Ghraib, before Joe Darby, the whistleblowing hero, exposed it, is the veil of secrecy. All of you who are lawyers have no idea what's going on at this moment at San Quentin, at Pelican Bay, at any of these prisons. If you were the governor of California and you wanted to visit San Quentin, it would take you a week to get in, get a week to get permission. If you were a lawyer, if you were the mayor of San Francisco, you could not get in there. I know I was an expert witness for one of the San Quentin Six. We had to wait 2 weeks, and this was a congressional subcommittee headed by Birch Bayh before we could get in. By the time you get in, everything is cleaned up. All the bad prisoners are hidden in some other place, shipped out of the prison. Prisoners eating steaks and stuff, and everybody leaves saying, not so bad. Same thing with Guantanamo. President of American Psychiatric Association, American Psychological Association went down there as their guests, and they all came back and said, we didn't see anything wrong. And then you question them, and it turns out they never spoke to a guard, they never spoke to a prisoner, they spoke to 2 interrogators after an 8-hour trip down and a 2-hour dinner and a briefing for 2 hours by the general in charge. And the 2 people they spoke to said, we don't do anything unethical. And the president and those associated came back and publicly said, we don't see anything wrong with it. So for me, the problem is the system shields the people in charge of potential abuses, and everybody in the system knows we can get away with murder because there is no oversight by the community, by lawyers, by priests, by Amnesty International. It used to be the Red Cross could get in. So I think that's one of the big issues that we face. In a democracy, there should not be a veil over these important institutions that we pay for with our tax money.
Before we conclude, one brief announcement and a brief comment. The announcement is that as part of this series related to the Botero Abu Ghraib paintings that the Center for Latin American Studies has organized, we will be showing, as the next event in the series, No End in Sight, a brand new documentary about Iraq on March 20th at 7 p.m. in Wheeler Hall. It won the Grand Jury Prize for Documentaries at Sundance. And in conclusion, I'd like to very briefly touch on what each of our speakers said. This is not a comprehensive summary, just 4 small points. Aryeh Neier brought up that torture is not simply an effort to extract information, but for submission. José Zalaquett pointed that art does bear witness, reminding us of what Fernando Botero said when he was here, that art can be a permanent accusation. Jenny Martinez cautioned that in the process of defending a nation, do not destroy the nation. And Philip Zimbardo reminded us, why no outrage? With that, I would like to thank our 4 presenters and thank everyone for coming.